Morning. Jason Cooper here with you on Flint's News Talk 1470 WFNT. Glad to be with you today. Joining me in studio, we've got a special guest today, Michigan Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley. He's actually on the ground here in Flint. Lieutenant Governor Calley, thanks for taking the time to be with us today. Welcome to the program.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you've been in Flint quite a bit since last fall when Governor Snyder says he was first made aware of lead issues in the water. A lot of things have happened since then. How are things going from your perspective?
Well, there's several aspects to the response. My personal involvement has really increased substantially in January, and when the state emergency was declared, and so the water infrastructure work, the testing is showing that the phosphate coating, the recoating of the pipes is the results are encouraging. I guess let me put it that way. There's a lot of testing that's being done by several different agencies. They'll be getting together in April to really share all their information and data, confirm, ask questions, but the results that we're seeing so far are encouraging. And at the same time, the actual pipe replacement has started. Now it's gone a little bit slower than anybody would like. Weather has gotten in the way of that, but the state has provided funding to the city that should cover more than 500 pipe replacements, and they're up to about 14 now.
Right.
But the issues with the weather in this time of year is difficult but as we get further into spring, then hopefully that will accelerate. And then beyond that, there's the healthcare and the education response, economic development. All of those things are in full swing, and so our goal really is to leave no stone unturned. That we really need to leave Flint in a better position than before. Anything less just isn't good enough.
Talk about that. Mayor Weaver, I just got a press release from her office today about the Fast Start initiative. You're talking about 14 pipes. I just saw a Detroit News article earlier this morning. And what's the relationship between Lansing and Flint like from the governor's office, your office, and the mayor's office?
Well, there's definitely growing pains when you have different entities that are trying to work together in a really high intensity situation like this is, and so it's not surprising that you have some bumps in the road, that you have some issues. But the key is that people have to keep working at it, and no matter what happens. I mean, there are times when things, communication wasn't the best, and then that's just an opportunity for people to recommit themselves to trying harder, working harder to stay on the same page, be on the same page, to ensure that at the end of the day, we need to do the right thing for the citizens there, and all of us that work in different government capacities. We have to set our own kind of preferences and egos and territories and that kind of stuff aside, and say, how can we work together for the best interest of the people of Flint?
I want to move on, and if you're just tuning in, we're joined in studio, Michigan Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley with us. He's been the man on the ground here in Flint since earlier this year. Been here 4 or 5 days a week. How many days a week are you averaging in Flint?
Yeah, it's actually about 3 days a week.
Okay.
That I'm on the ground, but there are other times when I'm either other places raising money maybe for the Flint Child Health and Development Fund, or working in Lansing on issues that are important for the recovery efforts here in Flint on top of that. So it is a very substantial effort. I've really focused, a lot of my early work was focused on early childhood education. Thankfully there are new preschool classrooms that have been opening up over the course of the last several weeks, and more to come. A lot of work that's happening in that early childhood education, which is a critically important aspect of a lead response. But the good thing about that is that it's actually something that's good for the community anyway.
Right.
So even for a child that hasn't had any exposure or lead poisoning or lead contamination, that early childhood education is just a good thing to offer to this community. And then the nutritional aspects of things, through the schools and also in communities, and making sure that the types of food that can help mitigate the impacts of lead are distributed. Those are the sorts of things that I've been working on or working toward, and there's been some great progress in those areas. The key is that we need to make sure that everything that we're doing is sustainable in the long term, and it would be nice if we could really look back on this time and say, that while the for as horrible and bad as the problems are with lead contamination, that maybe the legacy is a strong early childhood education system, a strong behavioral health care system, better nutrition for people in Flint, and then on top of that, a water system that has taken the bold steps of eradication of the lead risk in the first place. A lot of cities have lead pipes, and that's a risk that has just been accepted for a long time. But I think a lot of America is waking up to that right now because of the Flint example, to say there are vulnerabilities in having this present in our system. And so, neighboring city like Lansing, for example, they spent about 10 or 12 years. They just decided every year we're going to take out more and more of these lead pipes until they're all gone. And so that's a great proactive step, and maybe it's something that more communities should look at. While you can mitigate the risks of lead, the only way to eliminate it is to completely get it out. And that's what I hope to see happen in Flint, and I hope to see happen in other places too.
You bring up infrastructure, and I saw a great 60 Minutes report might have been a couple of months ago or last year, Ray LaHood, former transportation secretary, talking about how we don't invest in infrastructure in this country anymore, whether it be water systems or the roads, which was a big topic here in Michigan for some time,
Sure
but
was.
thankfully
Yes.
we got a deal done on that. But Governor Snyder, in some of his talks about fixing Flint, has also mentioned fixing the infrastructure elsewhere in the state. Your thoughts on that?
Well, what we put in the budget this year was an infrastructure fund to start working on the infrastructure that's underground. Now, we spent the better part of 4 years working to try and get additional investment into roads and bridges. Now, you can see and feel roads and bridges, and it was that hard to get that part of it done. And so, think how much harder it is to make the system, if you will, prioritize the underground infrastructure. It's easy to forget about or take for granted. In Flint, on average, that system is 80 years old.
Right.
And it's not unusual for a city an older city to have an infrastructure system that is that old, and so that ongoing regular investment to make sure that it's not just too old and dysfunctional, but also that it's the right type of infrastructure that is needed. One of the challenges faced in a city like Flint, where the population is half of what it used to be, is that the water can get more stagnant. It sits in the system longer because there's not as many people using it. So right-sizing systems is important, just as important as the composition questions of the actual pipes that are used. So these are the sorts of things that we need to get into. We started this infrastructure fund with an eye toward, and hopefully it'll get approved in this budget that we're working on right now, that will start that providing some resources and partnering with communities and advancing the really dire need that many communities have in making sure that their water and sewer systems are meeting the needs of the people and the environment.
You bring up right sizing of the infrastructure, and you bring up stagnant water, and I think that was a lot of discussion early on when people were coming in with discolored water. The system here in Flint, built for a city with a much larger population, it's down to less than 100,000 right now. Have there been talks about perhaps right sizing the infrastructure for the size that the city's at currently?
I want to caveat what I'm about to say by an acknowledgement that it is the city's system, and that we really do need to follow the mayor's lead on this.
Okay.
So while there are clearly some issues with the system itself being built for a much larger population, and that presents a lot of challenges, that when it comes to these long-term planning issues, that we need to work hand in glove with the city on that. One of the things that we'd put some resources, about $500,000 into hiring an engineering firm to do an evaluation of the whole system. And that's one of the things that they're looking at. We don't have that report back yet, but it's everything from the composition and how to go about a lead eradication plan in terms of the service lines, but then also how do you make the system so that you don't have stagnant water that sits in the system, and you make the system better suited to what the people need today. So that engineering is underway in terms of doing the evaluation of the whole system, and I do expect that there'll be recommendations that come back which indicate that there are changes that need to be made in the system that have nothing to do with lead, but just the overall condition, and with the, it's notorious for having so many breaks. I think 400 main breaks a year, something like that, and maybe better than half. I've heard even upwards of half of the water, 40% of the water, something like that.
Unbillable
Because it leaks out of the
Right.
system. So those are the sorts of problems that they might not be connected to lead, but as long as we're all working on this, why not try and deal with all of these problems at the same time?
Let's talk a little bit about the Flint Water Advisory Task Force that was created by Governor Snyder, and they released their findings. Was it earlier this week or last week?
Last week.
Last week they released their findings. What were your thoughts on their report? Because they had a lot of recommendations in there for the governor's office, for the city of Flint, for the MDEQ, for the US EPA. So what were your thoughts on the report?
Well, that task force, first of all, was highly independent. It was appointed by the governor, and I think people wondered, how independent will they be? Read through the task force, and you'll see that that was a very independent and thorough report with substantial recommendations. They were very good about communicating all along the way. They provided update letters and findings along the way, so it gave us the ability to do to kind of jumpstart reform efforts based on their recommendations. So there really weren't a lot of surprises in the final report because their communication right along the way was so good. And so as we were able to go through there, and even when the report was unveiled, able to go through, and I think the majority of them were things that were already well underway in terms of implementation. So I think it was a very solid report that gave some good information, a very thorough investigation of the entire thing, and something that the vast majority, at least, I think will be implemented.
You guys came out with a 75-point action plan for the city of Flint. Some of it was broken up into 4 parts: economic development, infrastructure, health, and education. Any thoughts on maybe revisiting that plan based on that Water Advisory Task Force report?
The task force report was more about how to change the way government operates. The 75-point plan are things that we need to do to help the people of Flint in the recovery efforts. And so they're kind of 2 different things, if you will. That so what a lot of the things when it comes to how the DEQ operates, that's not part of the 75-point plan, which is really specific to Flint. And so I view them as 2 different things. But to the extent that there is overlap, our plan is really a flexible plan, one that we have all these things that a lot of the healthcare response, for example, came from recommendations that came from Dr. Mona, who had put together some solid recommendations, some critical recommendations on how you respond to these things. We'd like to take that type of expertise and put it into the plan, so it's not just a government response, but really a community response based on what we're hearing from the community. So I do expect that plan will change as needs become apparent, and some things that tend to be bigger needs than others, and some that maybe we thought were bigger end up being smaller. But it's flexible. But the task force report, I think, is going to be less Flint specific and more policy based in terms of the way that the DEQ operates. For example, the DEQ operates in their relationship with any city, not just with Flint.
You bring up the DEQ, and something that I keep reminding our listeners, there was an audit that came out of the DEQ back in 2010. It was before you and Governor Snyder even elected into office, saying that there were problems with cuts to that department, and it could cause problems in the future. And unfortunately, that's turned out to be the case a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean clearly there are problems. And as much as it would be nice to kind of tie it off and say that that there were maybe some funding cuts, and so that's the problem. Funding problems are a lot easier to solve than I think the work that we have in front of us and the cultural changes that need to happen within the department. And it's not just to that. I would say overall that one of the things that if any government official anywhere in the country that is watching this, if there's a lesson to be learned, it is to give people the benefit of the doubt, to believe people, to default in a position of believing people. So you had a lot of people in Flint that were saying, we have this problem with the water. And then we had these experts, just a small number of experts that said, no, it's not a problem, it's not dangerous, it's not safe. Well, or saying it's not, it is safe. And so there's that system is kind of out of whack when just a couple of professionals' opinions can outweigh a whole community that says we have this big problem.
Sure.
And so culturally, I think that's where the big change has to be made. Is we default in saying, people say they have a problem, we need to believe them that they have a problem, and so even when you get an answer that might conflict with that, to dig deeper, to take those extra steps to be absolutely sure, particularly when it's health and safety that's involved in whatever that decision is.
I want to talk about the emergency manager law. Obviously, with the Water Advisory Task Force, there were some recommendations there that the emergency manager law might need to be revisited and looked at. And Flint, obviously, I mean, underneath emergency management, when the decision was made to switch from Detroit to the Carrick-Grande Water Authority and then use the Flint River as a primary source, any discussions in Lansing about maybe looking at the emergency manager law? I mean, right now we've only got, one entity under emergency management, that's DPS, and Stephen Rhodes, who led Detroit through bankruptcy, has said, I don't want to be an emergency manager, I want to be a transition manager. So what are the talks or the discussions on the emergency manager law, and maybe allowing a little bit more feedback from the residents?
Yeah, and I think that regardless of whether you have an emergency manager in place, that point stands, that feedback, input, inclusion, transparency, that these are all things that are really important for effective governance in any situation. So I would say that type of reform is needed, not just for emergency managers, but really that all government could take a lesson from it. The governor has indicated that he's open to looking at changes at the emergency manager law, and as I kind of look at this overall, we need to make sure that the type of success that the city of Detroit experienced, for example, that we not forget that the emergency manager law was a big part in that in that success that the whole state is benefiting from now. And so I think it's important that when we look at this, we look at the context to say that we want to make sure that Flint never happens again, but we want to make sure that we don't prevent things from getting fixed the same way that and experiencing the same type of success that the city of Detroit experienced. So I think it's a balance, like most things are in terms of the evaluation, but one of the more functional or practical things that I think that we should look at is that anytime when you have a situation like this where a city really is strapped, when a city is in dire financial distress, as Flint was to even qualify for emergency manager, that evaluation of capacity at things like public works is something that ought to happen. That's not really, emergency management hasn't really carried out that function in the past, but I think it would be appropriate that in those situations where you have insolvency or pending insolvency of a government, that evaluation of the capacity to deliver basic functions of government is something that ought to be a kind of a standard practice to ensure that as a city has had these stresses, that their capacity to deal with delivering clean and safe water, for example, hasn't been impacted negatively.
We've only got you for a few more minutes. I did see a report, and I want to bring this up. Michigan State report, it was mentioned in the Detroit Free Press the other day that lead levels could rise again due to lead in the soil, and it's part of a cyclical pattern. And the Michigan State researcher said, it's hard to determine what is the source of exposure in lead levels in blood, whether it be soil, whether it be water. I think Department of Health and Human Services, that's why they were a little bit reluctant initially to say, the lead levels, the increased lead levels are coming from the water. So your thoughts on that, especially when you brought up earlier in the conversation, we're seeing good results with these lead levels diminishing. So your thoughts on this Michigan State report?
I think that's the sort of that's the sort of information that really people need to understand all across our state, that lead is still present in our environment. There was a lot of years when it was in paint, and it was in pipes, it was in our gasoline, our fuel before. So there's a lot of residue from those old days of lead, and so what'll happen is, what we find is every time if somebody is test positive for lead poisoning, there's a home investigation done. In about 85 or 86% of the time, the source of the lead contamination was something other than water. And that means that we have a lot of risk factors out there. So, for example, in the soil, if there's lead in the soil, well, kids don't play in soil in the wintertime, so the risk isn't that great.
Sure.
But in the summertime, they got their toys and they're playing in the soil, and then hand-to-mouth type of action. Or whether it's dust in the house that comes from the walls, it's not
windows
just
open.
Yeah, and it's not just, people picture eating paint chips. That's not really what it's usually about. It's that there's just a gradual disintegration and a dusting that happens, and it can cause kids that are playing with toys that are on the floor that are coated with this dust and putting it in their mouth, that those sorts of things present a risk as well. And that's why it's important that we really educate ourselves about these risks, that it's not, water gets a lot of attention, but water is not the majority of the lead poisoning cases that we see across the state each year. It's soil and paint make up a much bigger percentage.
We've only got you for about 2 more minutes. I want to let you out of here on time, so hopefully you'll come back. How close is Flint going back to being safe, to not drink bottled water, and where are we on the bottled water supply? I know you've been active in some of the giveaways and stuff like that.
The bottled water will be there as long as it's needed. Okay. So from that standpoint, that's one of the areas where the federal government actually had a line item to help with in terms of resources, and then the state and the legislature appropriated money as well. While the test results come back are encouraging, we don't want to just rely on one entity's test results. Ours are about, with the residential testing, I think there's 16 or 17,000 now that have come back. About 92% are below the federal action level in terms of the lead count in the water, so that's good news. But in our Sentinel testing sites are the ones that we come back and test every few weeks. That those are trending in the right direction as well. But Virginia Tech and Mark Edwards is doing separate testing on the highest risk sites that he had identified before, and the EPA is doing sequential testing, which is a whole different way of doing testing as well. And what we're going to do over the course of this month, have all these entities come together, share all those results, get all those people in the room to really confirm, and then make a determination after that. So all I'm prepared to say today is that it looks like it's going in the right direction, but we'll look forward to having all these entities to make a determination about the safety of the water, hopefully in the next few weeks or months.
Well, hopefully you'll come back and share that with us. One last thing before we let you get out of here. Today is the start of Autism Awareness Month, and I know that's a subject close to your heart. It's something we've talked about before. You and your wife just released a video. Share with our listeners a little bit about Autism Awareness Month and how they can help.
People with autism have amazing potential. And so if there's a parent out there, and maybe you're a parent of a child with autism, or you're an individual listening that has autism, I just like to encourage people to really don't put limitations on what possibilities are. That people with autism can and do amazing things and change the world, particularly when properly supported. So if you'd like to learn more about it, my favorite place to go is autismallianceofmichigan.org. It's autismallianceofmichigan.org. And whether it's you think that you need some help in consultation because you think maybe your child has autism and you don't know where to go or where to ask, to all the way through to I'm going into this IEP meeting with my school, and I don't know what to ask for, what type of services that my child needs. That the Autism Alliance is a partner with the state of Michigan. They do a great job, and I would encourage people, if you want to learn more or you need help with your own family, that's a great place to go.
Michigan Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley, thank you for coming in today, and we look forward to future conversations. Hopefully we can get you back in here in the future.
It's been a pleasure. I look forward to it.
We got to take a quick commercial break. Stick around. More conversations with Jason Cooper on Flint's News Talk 1470 WFNT.